Chapter 2, Act 2, Cecil's Tale. Act 2, Cecil's Tale, the Premonition.
Prince Theodore.
Wedge gasped and knelt down next to the fallen boy, turning him over onto his back so he could get some air. His hair had faded back to its usual color, and his face remained clear of injuries, but his breathing was shallow and haggard. Biggs frowned. He wasn't quite to the point of panicking, it took a lot to get him to that point, but a passed-out heir to Baron was quickly getting him there. He hadn't been entirely serious about the whole
cleaning his blood off the walls comment.
Wedge.
Quickly.
Wedge closed his eyes in concentration, pressing a hand upon Theodore's chest.
Kira.
A shining white light sparkled over Theodore's still body. A few moments later, the prince stirred and opened his eyes, peering at an upside-down Biggs and Wedge. Theodore blinked, sitting up and rubbing the back of his head. It still smarted a little from when he had fallen.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that.
Even in a time of crisis, Theodore's royal etiquette would manifest itself nonchalantly. Wedge clapped his hands together, now that the potential catastrophe had passed.
I knew you could do it, Prince Theodore. You have amazing powers hidden inside you.
Theodore climbed to his feet, looking at the knight's emblem that was still grasped tightly in his hand. He wasn't sure if it was because he was still coming around, but he had no blasted idea what the thing was that he was clinging to for dear life. It felt like a piece of rope, but he hadn't remembered actually picking it up. He recalled Biggs and Wedge coming into the chamber, and then the extenuating effort it had taken for him to drag himself up off the ground to finish the sandworm, but his memory got fuzzy after that. He had felt warm and safe, like someone had wrapped him in a blanket and sat him down before a fire, and then it was like that same someone had turned out the lights and plunged him into darkness. Wedge nodded toward the knight's emblem.
Now you're a full-fledged knight, my lord.
I'm a knight. Theodore blinked. I can't believe it. I really did it. And all on my own. Biggs interrupted the impromptu celebration.
We're leaving. Our work here is done.
The three men silently returned to the surface level of the grotto. Theodore had automatically defaulted to walking behind Biggs and Wedge, his head down as he replayed what he could remember of the final battle in his head over and over again, his excitement growing with each step he took. When they finally arrived back on the shore at the grotto's entryway, Theodore was shocked to see that dawn's rays were pouring over them. He could see the polished cherry wood of the Red Wings fleet glowing like fire against the backdrop of the horizon. So, I really was in there all night. Theodore paused a moment, pressing his hands together.
Wedge. Captain Biggs.
Biggs and Wedge whirled around. Wedge was smiling, but Biggs looked bored.
Thank you. Thank you for everything.
Biggs huffed and turned around, walking ahead without another word. Theodore looked down.
Captain Biggs.
Wedge patted Theodore on the back.
I expected nothing less from you, Prince Theodore.
Theodore peered up at Wedge, reminded of his shameful outburst from before.
Listen.
But Wedge knew what Theodore was trying to do, and shook his head.
We must hurry to the airship. We'll get an earful if we're late again.
Theodore and Wedge walked back to the airship, and as they got closer, Theodore could see that the rest of their men were on board, preparing for takeoff. As Theodore climbed the ramp, the other soldiers let out a cheer, making him blush. Biggs must have told them that the trial had been a success.
Congratulations, Prince Theodore. Are you ready to return to Baron Castle?
The soldier at the steering wheel called out to him.
So ready,
Theodore grinned.
I can't wait to see the look on the king and queen's face when I tell them.
The soldier laughed, and Theodore could hear the engines starting. He couldn't believe how light and happy he felt. How could he have possibly thought before that it might not matter if he won or lost? This had to have felt a million times better, and it was going to open all sorts of doors for him in the future to prove himself even more. It wasn't my parents or my title that helped me back there. I helped myself. And once I figure out what that amazing power was that Wedge said I displayed, I'll hone it and finally be free to carve out my own destiny. Someday I'll have to shoulder the burden of becoming the king of Baron. But today, I just want to be Theodore, the Red Wing. After the ship had reached its cruising altitude, Biggs took a lap around the deck, checking on everyone and getting their status reports. When he reached Theodore, he stopped, putting his hands on his hips.
How's it feel, Theodore?
Theodore snapped out of his fantasizing, and stood up straighter.
Sir.
Instead of getting angry at him for not paying attention, Biggs merely repeated himself, much to Theodore's surprise.
How's it feel to be a knight?
Theodore flushed. He was giddy, but he didn't want to act so excitable in front of his new captain.
I'm not sure what to say, sir.
Biggs smirked.
Of course you aren't. The knight's emblem is just a name. You risked your life in there to obtain a mummified rat tail.
Theodore blanched, and swore that he felt the knight's emblem suddenly squirm in his pocket. So. That's what it was. Ugh. Biggs shook his head.
Have you figured it out yet, boy? You don't become a knight just because you obtained the emblem. It is simply a test of your resolve. You've only arrived at the start of your journey. There is yet a long road ahead before you truly belong to the Red Wings.
Theodore nodded, forcing himself to stand a little straighter.
Yes, sir.
Wedge joined Biggs.
Amazing, Prince Theodore. I can't wait to see you become a paladin and follow in your father's footsteps.
Theodore raised his eyebrows. He was in too much of a good mood for the time being to let Wedge's comment get him down, and he could sense Biggs eagerly waiting for his reaction, ready to pounce if it was deemed too whiny. I knew this would happen. That people are still going to compare me to father. But I can't talk back to Wedge, he's now one of my senior officers. Theodore took a tempered breath.
I haven't made up my mind about becoming a paladin yet.
That was an entirely different trial, one that his father had never really discussed. He realized dejectedly now that he was thinking about it, why wouldn't have his father ever told him about becoming a paladin? Did he think Theodore had never stood a chance, and that the most he could possibly amount to was joining the Red Wings? But you never asked him, either, a small voice whispered in the back of Theodore's mind. Wedge blinked.
Why not, my lord? With the blood from King Cecil and Queen Rosa, surely you could be.
A soldier in the rear of the ship interrupted them, screaming at the top of his lungs.
Incoming attack!
Theodore and Wedge whirled around, and Biggs turned red, raising his fist.
Calm down, soldier. You call yourself a knight of the Red Wings.
The soldier did not bother to have the grace to act chastised.
But Captain. We have monsters. Countless swarms of them.
He closed the scope he had been holding, and tossed it to them. Theodore happened to catch it first, and pried it open, gazing out toward the rear of the ship and gasping.
What?
A flock of bell pagars were heading straight for them. There were too many to count, but Theodore got to at least 15 before giving up. They were gargoyle-like creatures that had midnight blue scales and glowing, pupil-less amber eyes that once locked onto their prey, didn't give up pursuing it until it was dead. Theodore could hear the flapping of their bat-like wings beating in unison as they got closer and closer, and lowered the scope, collapsing it against his hip. He looked back at Biggs desperately, while nervously withdrawing his sword. His hand kept slipping, slick with sweat, as he tried to grasp the hilt.
Here they come.
Biggs nodded, motioning for the others to take their battle positions.
Brace yourself, Theodore.
Theodore tried to steady the shaking of his hands as he waited for the first monster to get close enough to attack. He could hear their pilot cursing as he tried to lose them, but Theodore knew it would only be a matter of time before the flock caught up. The ship could only go so fast, after all. What is going on? Theodore could hear Biggs and some of the other soldiers that knew black magic firing off elemental spells to try to keep the monsters at a distance. I thought that bell pagars lived in the mountains, and they don't normally travel in such huge packs. Maybe I'm remembering wrong. But this still doesn't feel right. A pair of monsters finally approached Theodore and Wedge from the side of the ship. They proceeded to hack away at the enemy with their swords, doing everything they could to keep the monsters away from the soldier trying to pilot the ship. But the felled beasts were quickly replaced by yet another pair, and then another, and another. Theodore tried to keep their energy up with a constant string of cure magic, but he could feel his reaction times getting slower and slower, and soon he was stumbling on his feet, his mana drained. He knew if he attempted to keep going that he would seriously hurt himself. Siphoning his very life force to cast magic was the quick path to an early demise. Gasping for breath, Theodore leaned back against the mast, wiping the sweat from his forehead that was stinging his eyes. He reached down, pulling the ether he had gotten in the grotto from the pouch hanging around his waist, and tossed it back, the sour liquid making his eyes water. Wedge killed another monster, and stepped backwards a few feet in an effort to cover the vulnerable prince. Biggs joined the two of them, not looking much better for wear. It seemed, however, as if the rear of the ship had been granted a temporary reprieve.
Gah! How can there be so many of them?
Wedge cast Cura on Biggs, who grunted his thanks. The pilot looked over his shoulder, his voice filled with uneasiness.
Sirs! Smoke is coming from Baron's direction.
Theodore gasped, pushing himself off of the mast he had been resting against. In his haste, he dropped the empty bottle of ether, which shattered upon collision with the deck and crunched noisily underneath his boots.
What?
Mother? Father? Theodore stormed through the broken glass toward the bow of the ship to get a better look. The pilot was right, thick, grey smoke was trailing into the sky in the far horizon. He pulled the scope out, his fingers trembling, and tried to take a closer look. It was blurry, but he could see a dark mass that had to have been Baron Castle, and the smoke appeared to be originating from the keep. He lowered the scope, feeling as if someone had punched him in the stomach. No. He closed his eyes, clutching the scope in his fist and looking down. What is going on? How could this have happened in just the time I was away? A sickening chill ran up his spine as he remembered how distant he had been with his parents right before he had left. All he had been able to think about was how much he didn't need them and about how exciting the prospect of breaking away from his identity as a golden prince was. But now, was that decision going to be made for him? Biggs, seeing the look of disheartenment on Theodore's face, thrust out his fist, barking his orders.
Full speed ahead.
The pilot nodded, and the process of shifting the gears of the engine made the entire ship shake beneath their feet. A Belphegor suddenly swooped down from above, screeching wildly as it extended its claws toward Theodore's listless form. Theodore looked up too late, his eyes wide with terror as the scope fell from his fingers with a loud clatter.
Prince Theodore!
Wedge dove forward, throwing himself in front of the Belphegor just as it raised its arm to strike. Baron Castle. The doors to the throne room opened, and Queen Rosa of Baron crossed the threshold, nodding to the two guards who promptly drew the doors shut behind her. Her hair was swept into an opulent bun, her long bangs framing her face and curling over her shoulders. She wore a form-fitting, long-sleeved white cotton voile gown that gently rustled as she approached the throne, her pink and purple ombre damask cloak flowing behind her. A white silk scarf was draped over her shoulders, hand-stitched with ivory accents, and a silver belt encircled her waist. Her eyes fell upon her husband, Cecil, the King of Baron. He was sitting in his throne, talking with the guard who held a constant post in the throne room whenever Cecil was occupying it. His shoulder-length hair was falling in his eyes as he spoke, and he was already dressed in his pearl white and navy ceremonial armor in anticipation of Theodore's arrival home later that day. She hadn't seen him in it since the day they were married. It was the armor granted to him by the Light of Mount Ordeals when he became a paladin, restored in crystal by the great smithy of the underworld, Kokol, as a wedding gift. Since then, the Baronian armory had added dark navy spikes added to the knees, and had fashioned a new pair of matching spiked pauldrons that sat high upon his shoulders, giving him even more of a regal air. There was no doubt in that uniform that Cecil was truly one of the most powerful men in the world. A gold and violet cloak was draped around his neck and shoulders, spilling over the seat of the throne. Rosa's heart was still heavy over Theodore. What if the mission didn't go as planned? Theodore had seemed so stressed and distant, he had barely uttered a goodbye to her when he left. Rosa thought back to her conversation with Cecil that morning when she had caught him gazing out their window, closely studying the full moon that could still be seen in the daybreak. And for reasons she didn't quite understand yet, she realized her son was not the only one she was worried for. Cecil had had the same distant look in his eyes as Theodore as he stared at the moon.
Rosa.
Rosa realized she had reached the throne, but had not yet said a word of greeting to anyone in the room. Cecil was smiling at her, and she could tell the guard he had been talking to was trying to keep a straight face in reaction to her vacant stare.
Sorry,
Rosa shook her head.
Just lost in thought.
She realized with embarrassment that she hadn't even had a real purpose for coming into the throne room in the first place. She had just suddenly felt like she needed to be by Cecil's side. What is wrong with me this morning?
I was just giving Kentucky the rundown on the preparations being prepared for Theodore's homecoming,
Cecil beamed. It warmed Rosa's heart to see how excited Cecil was about Theodore's rather hasty decision to join the Air Force, even more so that Cecil's faith in Theodore was so unshakable that there was no trace of doubt in his mind that his son was not going to come home a fully fledged Red Wing. She felt the guilt of her ambivalence weigh down on her heart even more. It wasn't that she didn't think Theodore could succeed, but something about this sudden turn of events just didn't feel right. For 15 years, Cecil, Rosa, and Theodore had been an inseparable family unit. Cecil and Rosa had taken great pains to give Theodore everything they had both lacked growing up in terms of parental guidance, along with the affectionate support of their dear friends they had met so long ago when fighting to save the Blue Planet. Of course, as the years had passed and the kingdoms of the world grew in their separate directions post-war, it had become harder to get everyone in the same place for even a few hours of visitation. It had quickly become the norm to have a birthday or another celebration with a friend or two missing, and nowadays they were lucky if the number of their friends who were able to attend various state gatherings could be counted on one hand. Cecil and Rosa understood it was part of growing up. They had been so young when they had been embroiled in the war and when they had started their family that it was inevitable that they, and their friends, would continue to evolve and grow apart with the years. But despite the distance that had become the standard between all of the warriors who had once saved the planet, the royal family of Baron had always had each other, along with Sid, of course, who was Theodore's grandfather in all but name. It was the one constant Cecil and Rosa had managed to hold on to despite everything and everyone, including themselves, transforming. As time marched on, it had simply no longer hurt as much as it once did to not see the others, and even the festering wound left from Kane's disappearance long before Theodore's birth had healed into impervious scar tissue. Rosa made herself return Cecil's smile, gazing into his eyes, the same shining blue as Theodore's. She couldn't keep wallowing in nostalgia. This was just another evolution that she had to face as a human, no, as a mother. And Theodore is evolving, too. He's not a child anymore. The peaceful moment between the two royals was shattered when a soldier burst into the room, choking for breath as he kneeled before Cecil and Rosa.
My liege. A large horde of monsters is headed this way.
Cecil frowned and narrowed his eyes in confusion, immediately rising from the throne.
What?
Rosa covered her mouth, her heart pounding.
But their numbers were supposed to be dwindling the world over. Where could they have possibly come from?
As if to answer her query, a violent quake ripped through the throne room, and she would have fallen forward if not for Kentucky grabbing her shoulders and pulling her upright against his chest. A loud screech could be heard from outside, and it wasn't human. However, she couldn't tell from what direction it had come from, or how far away it actually was. Cecil reached out, briefly resting his hand over hers.
You stay here, Rosa.
She opened her mouth to protest, but Cecil ignored her and turned to Kentucky.
Protect Rosa for me. Yes, sir.
Kentucky nodded, and Rosa could feel his grip tightening on her arms.
Cecil.
Rosa trailed off. There was another quake, and a raucous crash that sounded as if a pile of bricks had been demolished up above. She was half expecting the ceiling to collapse down upon them right that instant and end it all. Cecil shook his head, removing his hand from hers to withdraw his sword.
Don't worry about me. Just stay right here. I'll be right back once I figure out what's going on. I promise.
Rosa pressed her lips together. Nothing she was going to say would change his mind, she knew that much. She decided to bide her time for now. Cecil turned and left, the soldier who had burst in to warn them following closely behind. Rosa watched as the throne room doors slammed shut behind them, muffling another ominous crashing sound in the distance. Cecil ran toward the entrance of the castle, his heart racing as terrified citizens screamed and ran for cover all around him. It had been so long since any of the residents of Baron had had to deal with any kind of monster attack, that many of them simply had no idea what to do, particularly the younger generations that were in the castle now for magic classes and training. The chaos of the citizenry alone made for a precarious situation. Forgive me, Rosa. I can't put you in senseless danger. When Cecil and the soldier had reached the castle gates, he found another group of soldiers, dragoons specifically, frantically trying to bar the door. However, they weren't under attack, although there appeared to have been a struggle. Grey, powdery dust, the remains of monsters when they perished, was scattered everywhere, and Cecil saw that many of the dragoons' lances and swords were bloodied.
Where are they coming from?
Cecil asked, and the dragoons turned to their king breathlessly.
We don't know, sir. There are so many of them.
Cecil clenched his jaw in frustration. He supposed it would have been too simple for the monsters to just start marching in through the front door. Clearly, the dragoons had let none of the monsters pass through.
All of you, stay on your guard right here. Yes, sir. We'll guard the throne with our lives, sir.
Cecil retreated back into the castle, this time alone. As he crossed back into the great hall within the keep, which was now largely deserted, he came across a young boy dressed in the apprentice robes of the Black Mages, bawling his eyes out. He was collapsed on the floor, his straw hat askew and his oversized robe sleeves stained with tears and snot.
My mommy is in the village. I want my mommy.
Cecil kneeled down, placing his hand on the boy's back. For a moment, he couldn't help but think of Theodore, although it had been years and years since he had been this small and scared. And he had always been vulnerable only with Rosa. Cecil had noticed that Theodore had always tried to put on a brave face when his father was around. Please don't let Theodore come back to this chaos, may the gods keep him safe with Biggs and the others, far away from here.
Come now, it's not safe to travel to the village at the moment. Where is the rest of your class?
The boy sniffled and motioned behind him, where the stairwell that led to the black magic classroom was. Cecil hoisted the boy to his feet, and gently turned him so that he faced the stairs.
You need to go back to them until you are given the all clear, okay? Can you be the messenger for your class and tell them that for me?
The boy's hat flopped down onto his shoulders as he reached up to rub his eyes. As he looked back at Cecil, his eyes widened, and his lip began to quiver.
King Cecil. Behind you.
Cecil swung around just in time to raise his sword laterally to block the incoming blow from the Belphegor that had snuck up behind him. The Belphegor emitted a shrill cry as the king's holy blade burned its flesh upon contact. Cecil didn't even flinch from the impact. Raising his sword, he countered with a vicious thrust into the Belphegor's chest, causing it to stumble back in a daze and immediately erupt into a pile of dust. Cecil turned back to the child, who was staring up at him, mouth agape.
Go, now.
Cecil hissed, and the child turned, fleeing and disappearing down the stairs. Cecil pushed his hair out of his eyes, cursing under his breath. They've already made their way inside the castle. We need to secure the other areas, quickly. The castle gate is secured, and yet monsters are within the keep, so where are they coming from? Cecil knew that the throne room was being guarded by Kentucky, so he took off down the western corridor, which would take him to where most of the citizenry of the castle was housed. However, at the end of the hall, he ran into another dragoon that was standing guard, who appeared unhurt.
King Cecil.
The dragoon quickly bowed his head.
Have any monsters come through here?
Cecil asked breathlessly. The soldier shook his head.
No, my liege. Sid and several other soldiers stationed in the western tower have taken up arms to fight any enemy that may approach. This area is secure and we have evacuated everyone to the magic labs. However, I am not sure about the eastern tower and the shipyard. Very well,
Cecil nodded.
We must keep the Great Hall secured for anyone else that is found. Do not let anything through. On my life, Your Highness.
The soldier crossed his arm over his chest, making another quick bow. Cecil turned to run back the other direction, toward the eastern tower. As soon as he set foot on the walkway that carried him over the shipyard, he was ambushed by a Zu and 3 cockatrices, birds of prey that hailed from the mountains of the Far East, specifically, Mysidia. Cecil didn't have time to wonder how in the world they had made their way across the ocean to Baron. He struck them all down effortlessly with one swing each, watching as their bodies collapsed into the shipyard below and exploded into dust. Crossing into the tower that would take him back to the ground floor, he tried to enter the storeroom hidden just before the exit to see if anyone was trapped inside, but the mechanism that kept the room normally locked shut had been jammed. It looked as if something, or someone, had slammed into it, crushing it into the wall.
Is anyone in there?
Cecil called, banging on the door with his fist. He pressed his ear against the wooden door, but could hear no voices, and better yet, no monsters. Satisfied for the time being, he turned and made off to the shipyard. In the shadow of the walkway he had just crossed, Cecil could see the body of a soldier laying face down, unmoving. His blonde hair was spilled around him, tangled in dirt and blood. Running to his side, Cecil knelt down and cautiously turned the man over. The entire right side of his face was bruised and dirted, and blood was running down his temple, but Cecil could see that he was breathing, slight as those breaths were. His arm had a deep laceration that was still letting blood, and more unfortunate was the twisted state of his leg. Cecil could tell right away that it had been shattered. He realized the man must have fallen from the walkway above and tried to crawl into the shadows to hide.
Kira.
Cecil whispered, and in the fading light of the spell, the soldier opened his eyes, coughing weakly as he looked up at Cecil. By the cloudiness of the man's stare, Cecil wasn't even entirely sure if the soldier recognized who he was.
Erg. Where are these monsters coming from? I was running toward the tower when... Conserve your energy,
Cecil said firmly, and tugged off the taupe-woven bracer that was wrapped around his left forearm, tearing it into a strip of cloth and tying it around the soldier's bleeding arm wound.
Hide down here. I'll send help for you as soon as the eastern tower is secured. Do not try to stand, your leg is broken. If you have to, play dead.
The soldier moaned, closing his eyes again and resting his head in the grass. Cecil backed away, scanning the shipyard for any more monsters before making a beeline for the tower doors. He was greeted by a pair of shambling zombies shuffling at the base of the tower stairs, their decaying flesh hanging from their skulls by mere strips of skin. Tatters of clothing and armor hung from what had once been their chests, now rotting cavities that their rib bones jutted out of crookedly. They hadn't been able to figure out how to climb the stairs, but with Cecil's arrival, they had a new distraction. Turning their heads and locking their empty eye sockets in his direction, they lunged forward, their gnarly fingers clicking together as bone ground against bone.
Raise!
Cecil called, and a burst of gossamer feathers rained down upon the zombies, embracing them in heavenly light. A spell that was normally used to revive a human that was knocked senseless, it was a deathblow for any reanimated creature. Cecil pushed past the incapacitated beasts as he bolted up the stairs, the mere act of his hand brushing them aside dissolving them into nothingness once again.
If someone is here, call out to me.
Cecil yelled into the summit of the tower as he raced up the stairs. He thought he heard the sound of crates falling from above, but between the sound of his heart pounding in his ears and the echoed stomping of his footsteps reverberating in the tower spire, he realized he could barely make out anything else.
Help!
A familiar woman's voice screamed, and he heard another crash, closer this time.
Get away from me!
There's definitely someone here. Cecil breached the top of the tower, throwing open the first of two doors in the hall. He found a cowering woman in the far corner of the room, a staff clutched in one hand and a lit torch she had grabbed from the wall in the other. Her red hair was sticking to her forehead and neck, matted in sweat, and her white mage robes were torn down the front, like something had grabbed at her. Cecil recognized her as one of Rose's former handmaidens before she gave birth to Theodore and one of the castle's white magic teachers, Penelope. Penelope was being cornered by an ogre, an oafish, stupid, but terribly strong monster, which was 9 feet of solid muscle and malice. Once again, Cecil was struck by how bizarre it was that a creature like this was shambling around barren in plain daylight. Ogres usually kept to themselves, making colonies in dank caves or abandoned settlements shaded by lots of abandoned structures or trees. Cecil himself had only ever encountered an ogre in combat once before, when he was investigating the then-abandoned Eblanessa castle basement looking for survivors of Rubiconte's brutal razing of the castle. He had never seen an ogre even on the entire continent Baron sat upon, until now. Striking from behind before the ogre could even realize he was there, Cecil sliced his blade through the neck of the barbarian, lopping its head off cleanly and sending it rolling opposite from Penelope, thankfully. Penelope let out a shriek as the ogre's headless body crashed into the crates she had tried to pull around her as a protective fort, sending splinters of wood and food debris flying. Cecil reached out his hand, and Penelope hung the torch back up on the wall and grasped Cecil's fingers so that he could help her stumble over the twitching, dying body.
King Cecil!
Penelope cried, swiping her damp bangs from her eyes.
Thank you!
Cecil nodded.
Get inside the Great Hall. It's too dangerous here. Why yes, my liege.
Penelope gulped, and with one last glance at the ogre, clutched her staff tighter and disappeared through the threshold. Cecil could hear her footsteps on the stairs fading away as he ducked into the second of the two doors on the floor, glancing inside. However, it was empty, no signs of life or any disturbances. Cecil followed Penelope back down the tower steps, although she was long gone. Finding only a couple of monsters meant that they probably weren't coming from the east, but at least this part of the castle was secure for now. As Cecil traversed the shipyard to make his way back to the Great Hall, he glanced over at the soldier with the broken leg, noting that he was still safe, and peacefully resting. He would send someone back for him shortly, as soon as he could find the damned source of the invasion. I must sweep the western tower as well, Cecil thought. Sid and the others might need my help, and it will grant me access to the rear overlook. I should be able to see everything going on in the castle from there. As Cecil made his way back to the Great Hall, he heard a shout and the sound of armor grinding against stone. Readying his blade, Cecil followed the noises and found the soldier that was guarding access to the west of the castle on his back at the base of the stairs that led out to the courtyard. His helmet was knocked off and several feet behind him. His sword had also been tossed away. Cecil nearly tripped over it as he flanked the fallen soldier.
Are you okay?
Cecil bent down, and the soldier groaned, not opening his eyes.
I am sorry, my liege.
Cecil heard the clop of hooves above him, and looked up to see a centaur knight barreling toward him down the stairs, its lance reared. He rose and parried the monster's attack, groaning under the strain as he shoved the heavy beast away and surged forward, driving his blade deep into the centaur knight's horseflesh abdomen. The monster stumbled backwards, collapsing upon the stairs and bleeding out as it began to crumble to dust. Cecil whirled around, taking one last glance at the fallen guard. He had to hurry, lest another monster come to try to finish them off.
Hang in there, soldier.
There came no reply, and Cecil forced himself to turn away and run up the stairs, his heart sinking. He wove through the small hallway that would take him to the courtyard leading to the western tower and access to the overlook. Just as he was about to cross into the courtyard, he heard rushed footfalls behind him, and a voice that called his name. Even in distress, the voice sounded melodious, like a soothing lullaby.
Cecil.
Cecil stopped and turned. Rosa was chasing after him, her wooden sandals smacking against the blood-stained stone steps. Clutched in her hand was her crossbow, and her forehead was creased with determination. For a moment, Cecil felt a wave of déjà vu wash over him, taking him back nearly 17 years ago, when Rosa had stopped him in this very hallway after his most painful mission as a Dark Knight, executing the mages of Mysidia to abduct the Crystal of Water. The look in her eyes back then, the light within that seemed to penetrate his very soul, was the same right now, and burning with even more intensity.
Rosa.
Cecil took a step backward, barricading the exit that would take them to the courtyard.
What are you doing here? Where's Kentucky?
Rosa shook her head.
I told Kentucky I'm coming with you. He's continuing to secure the throne room and making sure everyone barricaded in the magic labs is all right.
Cecil turned away from her, sheathing his blade and crossing his arms over his chest.
No, you can't. I will not let you put yourself in danger.
This is much worse than I initially anticipated. I have to protect Rosa, at all costs. Rosa stepped forward defiantly, her cheeks turning red with anger.
I could say the same to you, Cecil. A white mage by your side would allow you to concentrate in case of a fight, wouldn't it?
Cecil looked down, feeling his resolve waver, just slightly. Of course, she was correct, she had saved his life more times than he could ever hope to count, and he hated to admit that he was already tiring from the battles he had won on his own. He had been out of the battlefield for so long, after all. But something harrowing and aching in his heart was holding him back. It was the same strange feeling he had gotten looking at the moon that morning from bed, a feeling he hadn't encountered in over 15 years. A part of him that had been asleep for a very long time, his Lunarian intuition, was rousing from its slumber. And that only happened when something was very wrong. He had initially thought that perhaps it was just Theodore's trial that was making him feel strange, but he knew now it had to have been something much more terrifying. And he was quite positive it would be revealing itself to him shortly, in whatever monstrous form that might be. And he didn't want Rosa there to witness it. Cecil sighed loudly. Despite the impending danger, he knew there was going to be no winning with her. She was the only person in Baron possibly more stubborn than himself, but perhaps he could negotiate.
Fair enough. But I want you to promise me this. If worst comes to worst, I want you to run away, even if it's by yourself. Run. And survive.
Rosa gasped, reaching for Cecil's hand from behind. Her fingers clutched his tightly as she choked out the words lodged in her throat.
And leave you to die.
The crippling anxiety that had taken hold of her heart when she entered the throne room earlier that morning came roaring back, like a tidal wave that smashed into her unawares and dragged her into the undertow. She had known something was wrong, and now she knew Cecil had felt it as well. They had been together so long, after all, ever since they were children. They didn't need words spoken aloud to know what was reflected in each other's hearts, be it happiness, love, or utter despair. Cecil closed his eyes, taking a deep breath as the warmth of her touch washed over him like a healing balm. Ironically, it gave him the courage to press forward with his bargain.
Yes.
He hesitated a moment. There was only one person in the world Rosa would put her love for ahead of Cecil's, although he felt terrible for using that love to manipulate her. But he wouldn't have done it if he hadn't felt so strongly for that one person as well.
For Theodore's sake.
Rosa pressed her lips together and willed away the tears that were threatening to spill down her cheeks. Of course, Cecil is right. Theodore is our only son. This kingdom's future. If he were to be orphaned. The tragedies of the past Cecil and I have been trying to protect him from would occur all over again. But Cecil, I would gladly give my life for you so that Theodore had his father. You are his only tie to his Lunarian blood. A future without you or my son. It's something I cannot accept. I know that makes me selfish. Rosa looked away, dropping Cecil's hand and clutching her bow so tightly to her chest that her knuckles turned white.
I promise.
Cecil nodded, pushing open the door without looking back at her. He didn't want her to see the look of agony twisted in his features.
Let's go.
In the courtyard, the morning sun was shining brightly, giving no credence to the anarchy breeding within the castle keep. Cecil saw several shadows fly past them, and as he gazed up, he saw a small group of monsters soaring high above, aimlessly cruising the castle perimeter. Either they hadn't spotted Cecil and Rosa, or the royals were of no interest to them at the moment. Cecil frowned, thinking aloud.
The monsters are coming from the sky.
Rosa shielded her eyes from the sun with her hand, looking around cautiously to see if they were about to be dive-bombed. When her eyes fell upon the heavy moon still visible in the sky, she felt the blood drain from her face. There was a shadow behind it, an unmistakable object growing brighter and larger.
Cecil, look! The moon!
Cecil followed her gaze, and was taken aback. Slowly but surely, a second moon was appearing. It was smaller than their moon, but still large enough at nearly half its size. It appeared to be almost emerging from their moon's shadow, as if it had been a sly child proudly crawling from a prized hiding place in a game of tag, the undisputed victor. Cecil couldn't tear his eyes away.
Is that Golbez's? Why now, of all times?
Rosa paused and shook her head. What could she possibly say at this point? She realized the answer was, nothing of consequence. A few yards away, a soldier was dead on the ground, his body blocking the entrance to the barren castle prison which had been converted into a glorified storage room due to lack of use. Rosa tried not to gag when she noticed the soldier's still fresh blood dripping down the door panels. Whatever had gotten him had made it swift and terribly painful. Taking Cecil's hand, she tried to lead him toward the western tower, where perhaps more citizens were hiding out, but even as Cecil followed her, his gaze was on the skies above.
Cecil, Rosa!
Cecil snapped out of it and glanced toward the overlook. Sid was calling to them from above, motioning for them to stay put. He disappeared, and a few moments later, emerged from the passageway that would have taken them to the overlook, panting for breath from taking the stairs down 2 at a time. Sid was as stout as ever, the only real sign of his septuagenarian status that his once flaming red beard had turned completely snow-white, something he blamed his rambunctious grandson mid for and not his actual age. There had been no gradual graying, it seemed as if Sid had just literally shown up to the castle one day with white hair. Coincidentally or not, it was the day after he took his only holiday from work that Cecil could ever remember in his entire life. Cecil recalled how one of Sid's apprentices had rushed into the castle on a lazy spring morning, letting Cecil know that Sid wouldn't be into work that day so that he could fret over his daughter's labor with his grandson. Cecil and Rosa had been so shocked that they were dumbstruck for a full 10 minutes after the apprentice left them. They had known that Amelia was expecting, thanks to Sid's overwhelming excitement and scientific, calculated nature. They practically knew the day the poor woman had conceived, but Sid had never taken a day off, until the day Mid arrived. But once Mid was here, everything had returned to normal in Sid's workaholic life, except for his hair. Sid pulled a red lacquer pipe from his mouth, which had nothing in it. Sid had picked up some new eccentric habits in the past 17 years, including smoking a pipe that didn't ever have any tobacco in it. Supposedly, Amelia had caught him smoking just one time, and reamed him out for it so loudly and violently that it was the gossip of the village for weeks after the fact. Sid never smoked again, but he had become so accustomed to the feel of the pipe in his teeth that he kept it on as an accessory.
You're damn late, Cecil. What be you been doing this whole time?
Rosa shook her head.
I'm glad to see you safe, Sid.
Sid puffed out his chest, pounding on it with his fist.
Of course I am. I haven't slowed down that much, you know. What I'd like to know, though, is where these monsters came from out of the blue.
Cecil put his hands on his hips, his voice not betraying any of the angst he had laid bare for Rosa just moments ago.
I wish I knew.
Sid pushed himself up on his tiptoes. As much as he hated to admit it, he had become even shorter with age, but no one dared talk about it, glancing around.
Where's Theodore? He's on an expedition with the Red Wings to obtain the Knight's emblem.
Cecil took a sharp breath. Rosa glanced at him with concern in her eyes, and Sid stared at the two of them, panic creeping into his tone.
He ain't back yet.
Cecil waved his hand as if the very motion itself would brush away any negative thoughts.
There's no need to worry. Biggs is there to take care of him.
Sid rubbed his hands together.
Well then, I guess we'd better do something about this place ourselves. Wouldn't want to spoil his celebration banquet. We are having one, right?
The only thing Sid loved more than airships and his family, natural and extended, was fancy banquet food and excuses to eat it.
The plans are already in place,
Cecil said with a half smile. Sid grinned, popping his pipe back into his mouth.
Fantastic. Follow me, I've already checked the West Tower and your quarters, no one is there. I'm guessing you want to see what's going on from above.
Sid led them through the passageway that took them to the overlook. Once they had climbed the steps and reached the top, Cecil approached the carved marble guardrail, staring into the distance. There were no signs of monster hordes around the perimeter of the castle, and Cecil could still see the dragoons he had stationed at the gates, all alive and well. If any more monsters had approached, they had been already dispatched. Even further out, in the village, things appeared to be peaceful enough. Cecil shook his head in disbelief. What was the logic to these attacks? If the monsters were trying to get to as much of the barren population as possible, the village would have been the ideal target, not that Cecil wasn't grateful this wasn't the case for now.
The castle gate has not been breached.
Sid slammed his fist into his palm.
That means they must have flown in. I was wondering where they had come from with all the guards stationed around the castle.
Rosa, who had been warily eyeing the sky with her automatic crossbow cocked to her shoulder, took a few steps backward and pointed to the west.
Here they come.
A flock of 4 bell pegars was heading straight for them, making their descent upon the castle. Sid and Cecil withdrew their weapons, and Rosa peered through her bow's crosshairs, firing off a series of arrows in rapid succession. 2 of the bell pegars fell from the sky before they could reach the party, having been struck dead by Rosa's remarkable aim. The other 2 doubled down on their speed, screeching as they tried to swat at Cecil and Sid from above. Rosa closed her eyes, a warm aura encircling the party as she blessed them with protect, shell and haste magic. With their enhanced defenses and Sid's massive hammer, the monsters were quickly destroyed, but more rushed over to eagerly take their place. After 20 minutes of seemingly endless battling, the 3 of them pressing their backs to each other to cover all angles, they were granted amnesty, although the distant screeches that carried back to them on the wind indicated that it would not last for long. Sid set his hammer on the ground, leaning against it as he wheezed for breath.
Cecil. These guys are coming at us in numbers like nothing we've fought before.
Rosa rubbed her sleeve across her forehead, sweat dripping into her eyes and dangling off the ends of her eyelashes like the morning dew.
There's just no end to this.
Down below at the castle gates, Cecil could hear the dragoons engaging in a new battle. An unsettling scream came from the shipyard. Cecil feared it was the soldier he had found under the bridge and that a monster had appeared to finish him off. He looked up at Rosa and Sid, both undoubtedly as enervated as himself. Sid was mopping the sweat from his ruddy face, and Rosa's hands were visibly shaking as she struggled to load the last of her arrows into her crossbow's magazine. Cecil clutched the handle of his sword as he lowered his head. He knew that this wasn't the end of their fighting. His Lunarian blood was pulsating with a fearful premonition as adrenaline coursed through his veins. He realized he had to help them escape while he was still standing.
Sid, I've got a favor to ask.
Sid took his pipe out of his mouth, raising an eyebrow.
I'm listening.
Still not looking up from the ground, Cecil pressed his lips into a straight line.
I want you to take Rosa and get out of the castle.
Rosa blinked, a couple of arrows slipping from her hand and clanging to the ground.
Cecil.
Cecil finally found the nerve to look into his 2 dearest friends' eyes. They deserved to know the truth, what his ancestors' blood was warning him of. Sid's gaze was obscured behind his goggles, but Rosa's wide hazel eyes were riveted to his, the pink shadows underneath further pronouncing her exhaustion.
Baron will fall before long if this continues.
Rosa's eyes darted away as she shook her head.
Cecil.
Sid let out a half-hearted laugh, as he normally did when things were starting to take a turn for the uncomfortable.
Planning on going down with the ship?
Rosa slung her bow over her shoulder, crossing her arms over her chest.
I'm staying with you.
Cecil crossed the small distance between them, clasping her shoulders and forcing her to turn to him. She was shocked by how deeply his fingers dug into her skin. They didn't hurt, but she felt an uncomfortable urgency reverberating from his grasp.
We had a promise. These are the king's orders, Rosa. Take care of Theodore.
Rosa looked up at him defiantly, not saying a word. Sid put his hands on his hips.
Ah, brother. He always has to be so darn stubborn.
Cecil gave Sid a desperate look. This was no time for jokes.
I'm counting on you, Sid. Please.
Sid waved his hand dismissively and popped his pipe back into his mouth. He couldn't let Cecil's dramatics get to him here. He had to be strong for Rosa. If it had been any other king, Sid would have told them to bite it. But he knew when to take Cecil seriously, and recognized that this was one of those times.
Leave it to me. Just make sure you don't get yourself killed, got it?
As he walked past Cecil, he gave him a light slap on the back, and Cecil watched as Sid disappeared down the stairs that would take him back to the courtyard. Rosa bit down on her lip.
Cecil.
He turned back to her, swiftly lifting his hands from her shoulders to her face and pressing his mouth to hers fervently. She closed her eyes for just a moment, and then broke away, tears stinging her eyes as she took a few steps backward, taking in the suffocating despair pooling in her husband's eyes. When she could bear to look upon him no longer, she turned away and fled after Sid, her footsteps echoing mournfully behind her down the stairwell. Cecil gazed out toward the castle gates, his heart pounding so hard that he thought for sure the monsters could use it as a homing beacon. A few moments later, he spotted what he was looking for, Rosa and Sid's diminishing forms breaking past the dragoon's stronghold and vanishing into the woods beyond. Rosa. Theodore's in your hands now, my dear. A cold, unsettling shadow passed over Cecil's form, making him feel as if he had suddenly stepped out into a winter storm without a coat. Glancing up, he was shocked to see a large, wyvern-like form sail past the twin moons and circle around, as if to ready a landing nearby. Cecil had only ever seen a dragon that enormous and that shade of night in his entire life. It was Bahamut, the All-Father of the Eidolons. As Bahamut drew closer, Cecil could feel the warm wind from Bahamut's speeding wings rush into his face, whipping his hair back. The dragon began to hover precariously over the ground, steadying his descent, and a slender figure jumped down from his back, briefly hidden behind Bahamut's wing. As she stepped forward, Cecil felt a jolt of excitement lighten his feet, and he began to run to her.
Rydia!
He exclaimed. She stared at him coolly, tossing back a wave of green hair. She was wearing a flowing white gossamer gown that hung from her shoulders and blossomed into two long sleeves that billowed over her delicate white wrists. Fastened around her neck was a large silver and ruby-encrusted necklace that draped over her collarbone, with matching ruby orbs dangling from her ears. Her bare feet barely made a sound as they touched down to the overlook. But as Cecil got closer, he realized that something was wrong. Wait. No. With the light of the twin moons shining down upon her, the girl's hair was revealed to be more of a shining teal than green, and fell in soft waves just past her shoulders, with wing-tipped bangs that framed her forehead and fell right above her lightless eyes, stained a deep amber hue. Cecil could see those eyes burning into him with each hesitating step he took, until he finally willed himself to stop a few feet away from her. Where have I seen those eyes before? Cecil wondered, feeling himself break into a cold sweat at just the sight of them. Deeply disturbed, yet apathetic at the same time. The girl cocked her head. Her ruby jewelry jingled as she moved, like a bell you would tie onto a meddlesome cat.
So you're Cecil?
Cecil drew in a sharp breath, his hand hovering at the hilt of his sword as if by instinct, like his body had done this before. So, we have met. My body remembers. But my memory fails me. Cecil narrowed his eyes.
You know who I am.
Without deigning to reply, she glanced instead at Bahamut. Cecil followed her gaze, and was horrified to see that Bahamut had been biding his time while Cecil was entranced by the mysterious girl, silently preparing his signature attack, Mega Flare. Smoke was curling out of his nostrils, and with a low growl, his jaws began to part, revealing gleaming rows of teeth and bubbling flames spilling between them like molten lava oozing from a volcano, the fiery drips sizzling on the stone under their feet. With one yawn of Bahamut's gargantuan maw, a maelstrom of fire and ensorcelled fury washed over Cecil, engulfing the entire overlook within seconds with exploding flares and billowing smoke. The soldiers that heard and saw the explosion from below let out a series of astonished screams and shouts, barreling past each other to abandon their posts and investigate what happened. They ran in such haste that they didn't even notice the threatening presence of the massive dragon peering down upon them from the eye of the destruction. As the flames began to clear, giving way to more entrails of smoke that escaped into the sky, the girl peered down at the defeated king of Baron, collapsed at her feet in a pitiful heap. For a brief moment, she thought she saw the gleam of a holy white aura entwine itself around his still body, but it flickered and disappeared as soon as she knelt down to investigate. Reaching out as if she were afraid of being burned, the girl gingerly ran a finger through Cecil's silver-white hair, letting the silky locks dangle from her fingers like a ribbon as she lifted her hand up and away. Pressing her cheek against her hand, she tilted her head in thought and gently rocked on the balls of her feet, musing out loud over Cecil's fallen form.
So this is the limit of a half-breed. As expected.
The Red Wings. Theodore fell to his knees and covered his head just as Wedge struck at the beast attacking him, landing a critical blow to its heart right at the last second. The Belphegor screamed in defeat and burst into dust that rained over Theodore's cowering body. As Theodore clenched his eyes shut, he felt a sudden and violent snap in his chest, like his heart had been torn away from his arteries, forcing the breath out of him like a child popping a balloon with a needle. He cried out in agony, digging his fingers into his skull in a futile exercise to distract himself from the pain. In his mind, there came a flash of blinding light, and his father's face appeared, smiling and kind as he lifted a young Theodore into his arms and perched him on his shoulder, gazing out into the night sky while the full moon shined upon the castle overlook. Father, tell me what it means again. When you said we were Lunarians? Does that mean our true home is on the moon? That one right over there? Not exactly. Long ago, our ancestors, the Lunarians, came to the blue planet on a moon similar to that one, but it went away when the war ended, before you were even born. There, they sleep, waiting for the right time to join us forever. When that happens, there will cease to be Lunarians and humans. We will all become one people, and evolve together. But if they are sleeping, why are you and I here? Shouldn't we sleep with them? I was born on this planet, Theodore. And of course, you were too. That makes the blue planet. And Baron, our home. My father, he would have been your grandfather, fell in love with a human woman, and they had a family. And I fell in love with your mother, and that's how you came to be. Even though you and I only have a fraction of Lunarian blood, it's as strong as any magic in this world, and as powerful as any human bond. When I'm really scared of something, I can feel your grandfather's light within my very soul, giving me the strength to face my fears. And I hope someday, my light will protect you as well, and help guide you in the world when you have to be without me. But that's not going to be for a long time, right? Of course. You and I. We share a special bond, thanks to our blood. We'll always be together, even when we're not, because you're my son. Theodore felt the tears spill from his eyes before he even realized he was crying. Try as he might, he couldn't seem to sense his father's presence any longer. All he could do was recall memories, random conversations, arguments, mundane events. He could no longer reach deep inside himself, and take hold of the delicate thread that had been woven around his heart for as long as he could remember. With it would come the warm, consoling feeling one had when they knew they were being protected. Now, his fingers grasped at empty air, something had severed the thread, and left him with a glacial, hollow feeling in his chest. Theodore moaned into his knees, hiccuping as he gasped for air.
This feeling. It couldn't be that my father.
Behind him, Biggs growled as he spotted yet more monsters closing in on the ship. It was only going to be a matter of moments before they would be able to reach the deck, and they would need to take up arms once more.
Maximum speed. I don't care if we blow the engine to pieces. We're already beyond maximum output, Captain.
The pilot protested. There was a violent dip in the ship's altitude that nearly made Theodore throw up. He slowly pulled himself from the floor, grasping onto the bow of the ship in an attempt to gain his bearings. He was shocked to see the ship weaving in a frenzy, and a new gang of monsters had weaseled their way under the ship while the crew was distracted by the beasts approaching from the rear. Theodore watched in horror as 3 bell papers surfaced where no one could reach them with magic and slammed into the side of the ship as a collective unit, resulting in a loud explosion of splintering wood and sputtering engines. The ship began to spiral uncontrollably, the steering wheel spinning so hard that the pilot was thrown to the deck from trying to hold on.
We've gone off course.
Theodore blanched. He could see the ship taking a hard turn away from the yet distant continent that contained Baron and instead drifting toward a massive swath of forestry to the south. Another soldier ran to them from the rear of the ship, nearly falling on his face as the ship took another extreme dip.
Critical damage to the right wing. We've lost control.
Theodore screamed as one of the monsters that had attacked the wing rose before him, striking him with a clubbed tail before he could even attempt to block. He was thrown into a mast, stars bursting in his vision as he slid to the deck and gasped for the air that had been knocked out of his lungs.
Prince Theodore!
Wedge cried. The ship shuddered once more, tilting deeper as flames began to crawl up the damaged wing. Theodore could taste the acrid smoke on his tongue as his strength gave out, and he mercifully lost consciousness, his body idly sliding down the deck as the ship's stern jutted into the sky. Biggs let out a string of curses as the pilot climbed back to his feet and tried to wrestle the wheel back under his control, but even he could see it was far too late for any further attempts of corrective action. As the ship spiraled dizzily into oblivion and the flames licked higher, now claiming the sails, Biggs threw his body over Theodore's, shielding the prince from the suffocating smoke and the screams of the other soldiers. End of chapter.